Good morning. Good morning. I hope all of you are enjoying this nice weather down here in Florida. Liquid sunshine occasionally, but we might have the last days of warmth after we leave here for the fall. So I hope you enjoy the weather. I'm pleased to say that we have a great lineup this morning for you that are joining us via webcast. Thank you, RCR, as our webcast and our show media partner. I would like to also mention that in addition to a great program, we have a spectacular finish. We're going to give away $1,000, two $500 drawings for those lucky souls that are brave enough to come out this morning and join us in early breakfast. I think you're going to really enjoy the conversation today. We also will be giving cash prizes to the app's users. I don't know if you've downloaded the app, but we monitor the uses on the app, and we'll give an award to the first, second, and third place for those using the app. Also note on the tables you'll see an evaluation form, and that will be your ticket to the drawing. So as you're sitting there listening to these great presentations, you might want to go on and fill out the form, and then after the panel, the CTO panel, will give an opportunity to get those into a box and get you a ticket, and then we'll do a drawing. So I think we've got a really interesting lineup. To get things started this morning, we're going to hear from Chetan Sharma, who is the founder and CEO of Chetan Sharma Consulting. He's literally one of the leading strategists in the mobile industry. And he's served as an advisor on wireless issues for several Fortune 100 companies. And I think you're probably one of the only strategists that have served and worked for the 6 top global mobile operators in the world. And so I think you're going to enjoy the presentation. This morning we'll discuss upcoming mobile technology, and again, how will we live and work with this new change coming about. So it's my pleasure, indeed my honor, to introduce Chetan Sharma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's my honor to be here and talk to you about my thoughts on what's happening in the mobile space, and largely the broader technology ecosystem and how we should think about the changes that are coming in our ecosystem. So as Steve mentioned, I've been doing mobile strategy stuff for some time, working across different continents for different players, with main focus on product strategy and market research. Have written a number of books and papers, try to stay current and ahead of the trends over the years. And one of the things that really surprised me was the introduction of selfie sticks, which turned out to be the biggest technology innovation last year. You can find them pretty much everywhere. Are not immune to it. But I really wanted to talk about what's happening in the mobile space and the broader technology space, especially around the various technology curves that are clashing with each other, creating new opportunities and challenges for some of the existing players. So if you broadly look at the last 200, 300 years, you'll see that technology cycles, computing cycles, network cycles, and the revenue cycles collide against each other time and time again. And when that happens, it creates a new set of opportunities for newer players in the ecosystem, and we take a leap forward in terms of the GDP growth and in terms of economic cycles. So this kind of slide summarizes the last 300 years of technology evolution. And as you will see, the most interesting things have really happened in the last 34 years and will continue for the foreseeable future, where the computing power on devices, the networks that are in front of us, as well as what's coming, and the number of players that are emerging around the world are literally shaping the various industries, not just the mobile industry, but literally every industry. Before I get into what I call connected intelligence, I wanted to just do a brief on kind of the history of connected intelligence, which is essentially combines two main notions, which is connectivity and intelligence, to enhance various industries. And so while we think IoT is fairly new, the notion of IoT has been around for at least 200 years. Starting with Schilling, who exploded some mines in the French War of 1812 using remote devices. And as most of these things, the way they happen is a lot of the technology actually enters through what's being applied to wars and military. So Schilling did that in 1812. Following that, Jacobi did something similar, sending messages to the palace from a distance. Obviously, these things were wired at the time. And subsequent to a number of innovations that in the 1800s, Panama Canal used a number of sensors to gauge the water flow and what's happening in the channel. So IoT was up and running at that time. It just was not called IoT. Metrograph again kind of started to happen in late 1890s and into the 1900s, where you measure weather phenomena using instrumentation. In 1958, Space Labs joined with NASA to measure the various variables on astronauts so they can advise them appropriately. Around the same time, DARPA probably led the work on sensor networks. So a lot of sensors that you see on your devices today are because of the work that was done some time back. And I think if you want to see what's coming in 10, 20 years, keep a close eye on what DARPA is working on. Another kind of fascinating discovery as I was researching the IoT space was the common understanding was that the term IoT was defined in 1999 at MIT Auto ID Labs. But actually it happened much earlier. A young man named Peter Lewis, who had founded Cellular One in 1985, very clearly enunciated the arrival of Internet of Things. And that speech was buried in the archives until recently, when I asked him to dig up that speech from his floppy disks. And it's remarkable how clear his thinking was. And so he didn't get his due credit, but hopefully he will now. Fast forward to 2015, sensors are literally everywhere in pretty much everything imaginable. And it's not just about sensors and devices, it's also about what you do with them. And so to the right are the companies that are already making $1 billion or more from what's termed as IoT today. And this number of companies making $1 billion will jump significantly over the coming years, probably doubling every year. So, if you look at exponential growth, the number of factors that are taking place simultaneously, which are impacting what we are seeing in the industry today. And so if you look at the cheapest gigabyte available, and so 3 gigabyte a month is the average in the US, it'll cost about $200. In 1991, it would have got you a bill of almost $9 million. Similarly, US data traffic, 5 terabytes a year in 2007. Now we consume that in 2 days. And by 18, it'll be in hours. And so you can see the exponential growth, or even just less than a decade. And the way to understand exponential growth is, if you put a grain of rice on a chessboard and double every square, and by the time you reach to the 64th square, you'll be looking at 18 quintillion rice grains, weighing 210 billion tons. And so every time you kind of reach the next square, the curve looks like this. And so until people don't notice that the exponential curve is taking place until it's too late. And that has repeated in the history. And so it's good to watch out for what's exponentially growing and what's approaching that knee curve. And so I'll just walk through some of the some of the data points. So digital information obviously is exponentially increasing. Every year we consume more, getting to 44 zettabytes by the end of the decade. Similarly, smartphones sold. It doesn't look like a hockey stick curve, but if you go back, 5, 10 years back into history, it will look like a hockey curve, reaching 2 billion smartphones sold by the end of the decade. Data traffic is still growing very fast around the globe. It has slowed down a little bit in the US, but around the globe it's still exponentially increasing. Then you look at wearables sold, probably will end up with more than 200 million. Connected devices going from 16 billion today to 26 billion. Data revenues will double, reaching $1 trillion by end of the decade, and clearly doubling from the last 5 years. But more interestingly, the OT revenues are increasing even faster, and globally will exceed access revenues by end of the decade. It has already happened in some countries. So the question becomes, what is connected intelligence and what are the building blocks? The way I kind of see it is a layered approach, that you have a bunch of sensors and objects at the bottom that's feeding the network. So connectivity is important, but so are the other elements, intelligence, data, trust, and number of industries on top. And the way to think about is each of these blocks is literally a $1 trillion industry. And so as you go into devices and intelligence, mining the data, to change each of the industries that are on the top. And I'll walk through some examples as to how that is happening today. So if you look at devices, 16 billion today, clearly smartphones and feature phones dominate, but you are seeing all sorts of other devices entering the mainstream. And the computing landscape has shifted dramatically as well. From Windows, we have completely moved to iOS and Android in a matter of 5-6 years. With iPhone clearly dominating. I mean, you can see the clear demarcation of pre and post PC world, where in 2008, iPhone had a very small share. Now iPhone alone has more revenue than number of other peers combined. Growth in various technologies, clearly internet is a big factor, but so are the smartphones and other devices that are entering the mainstream and almost reaching saturation in most cases. So that doesn't mean the market is gone, it just means that market has matured and we're looking for a next breakthrough in those categories. Literally the IT spend per household is dominated by smartphones, reaching 50% of the overall IT spend in the US. Number of devices that have sensors in them is that the reason we are at 16 billion going to 26 is because literally of these devices which we don't think about, things that go in turbines, go in windmills, go in automobiles. I mean, automobiles today have more than 26 computers and innumerable sensors that continuously track what's happening in the automobile. And so these are the sensors that are driving a lot of the growth and understanding of our space. Then we come to connectivity. As 5G discussions have started around the globe, especially Europe and Asia, and now in the US, with Verizon coming in with an early announcement for 2017 deployment. But it's, it might seem that we are premature in this discussion, but historically we are right at the mark of when these cycles come up. So if you look at the performance, data performance of operators worldwide, the number of operators making $1 to $20, $50 billion every year from just data services is continuously increasing. And so we'll reach 60 operators making $1 billion or more in data revenue, which is pretty remarkable given that the industry is still very nascent. Number of countries where consumers are consuming a gigabyte or more, it continues to expand. Meaning there's just more demand for data services. And in some countries, mobile is the only way to access the internet, access digital services, only way for governments to work with their citizens, or for companies who are looking to work with consumers. That's the only channel they have. I talked about data traffic, how fast it's increasing in the US. I mean, it's remarkable. Most of the traffic is now going over LTE in a short amount of time. And I think the amount of traffic that we consume is in gigabytes, and depending on the pace of technology, we'll be talking terabytes within a decade. So I think what's fascinating is each generation of technology that comes in generates 3x more revenue than the previous one, while the capex doesn't increase in that ratio. And so when you enter from 1G to 2G and 2G to 3G and even from 3G to 4G, that has stayed consistent, that you're making 3x. But what's more exciting is I think what will happen with advent of 5G or even at the tail end of 4G, that you will see a number of other industries spawning, which will increase the level of revenue generated in the industry. The role of fixed and Wi-Fi is clearly very important, which could lead to alternate models of how we think about access. We could see different ways to deploy new networks, especially for greenfield operators. And we're already seeing that in some other countries. US is a bit difficult because of the geography, but I won't be surprised within the next 5 years some alternate models take hold. CapEx, they go through the cycles. Obviously, depending on it varies by country, but I think we are at the tail end of the 4G investments, and depending on how we end up defining 5G, we'll probably start the 5G investment curve fairly soon. There's a lot of debate around whether wireless can substitute wireline. And I think it's always a question of economics, and economics still favors wireline. You can push more bits at lower cost on wireline. And so while wireless has been consistently increasing, wireline economics are still a way ahead. And as such, I think we have to think about how we define a network. A combination of wireline and wireless is clearly very important. And the key performance criteria, I mean, engineers have always focused on bits per second per hertz and going into energy consideration. But I think as we go forward, a key criteria is also going to be the cost. What does it take to move a bit from point A to point B at the lowest cost possible? And as such, different alternate models, where it's direct D2D or whether it's Wi-Fi or alternate access models, I think cost is a key consideration of how you move bits around, especially because the video traffic is going to be so enormous, literally 80-90% of the overall traffic. And so you cannot rely on traditional ways of designing network or monetizing those networks. Another concept or thesis I had is around something called fourth wave, which I talked about 3 to 4 years ago. And the notion was that looking at the data, it was very clear that every major curve, revenue curve, starts to decline after it reaches 70-90% penetration. And so voice clearly was declining in the US, in many parts of the world. Literally in every major country, voice is declining. Same happened with messaging. Access is still a very nice growth story, but we're already seeing signs that it'll taper off in the next few years. And so it'll reach the top and it'll start decline at some point. And it starts to happen in some parts of the world already. And so it's not difficult to envision that it'll happen in pretty much every country, just time shifted. So the notion is, if all the previous three curves are going to decline, where the next growth opportunity is going to come from, and hence the fourth wave. And this wave is very different than the previous three curves, primarily because of its complexity and the number of players in that particular microcosm. And so it's no longer just the operators dominating the ecosystem, but newer players like the Amazons of the world and Googles and Facebook and Xiaomi and other players who are entering the ecosystem, who are changing the way wireless is monetized. And as such, operators have a critical decision to make as to where they're going to play long term. And the long term is not 10 years, long term is 2 to 3 years. And if they don't have a strategy in place to deal with this curve, then I think the market will define how that operator is perceived in the future. And so literally after I had introduced the concept, many of the global operators embraced the notion of the fourth wave and start focusing on digital services and as a key pillar for growth in the coming days. A milestone was reached last year when OTT revenues were more than access revenues. So the traffic generated by applications generated from the applications on top of access layer were generating more revenue than the access layer itself. And as I mentioned before, we'll reach that milestone for the global market by 2020. Big shift in how revenues are allocated, going from 80%, 75% to 30% for the operators, and fourth wave literally taking over. Same happens for the global market. And my sense is, based on what's happening today, less than 5% of the operators who are truly in the digital space at the top. Another way I measure progress is number of companies that are generating revenue, $1 billion or more in revenue from fourth wave services. And this is not valuation, it's actual revenue. And so if you look at 2010, there were four companies, all major players, reaching 9 in 2012, 35 in 2014, and exploding to 62 by end of this year. So as you can see, number of players is changing. Another way to kind of digest that information is looking at this graphic, 2012 and 2015. And these are players from all over the place, from China, from US, Europe, India, and so on and so forth. Another way to think about fourth wave is the change in value. So if you look at valuation of Uber is more than Sprint and T-Mobile combined. And you can see the others. So the players who kind of are defining the ecosystem has changed in the last 5 years. The strategy will depend on the three critical layers: access, platform, and applications. And different players will play in different areas. As operators, you have to figure out beyond access, are you going to play a role in other categories or not? And if you do, then how? Another key area is intelligence. We are at the very primitive way of understanding data. It's mostly post-processing. But once we get into a phase of autonomous intelligence where things just figure out themselves and feed back into the system to make intelligent decisions, I think that's where we're headed. And the reason is another key impact on the industry will be when the cost of labor curve coincides or clashes with the automation and robotics. And whenever that curve collides, you will see the shift from traditional labor to automation and robotics in various industries. Very quick, something about Synaptic Supercomputer. It's a computer that was chipset designed at IBM, which mimics the brain, which is a fundamental breakthrough in computer architecture, which essentially provides enormous computing power at a very low power. And I could talk for an hour on just this subject, but I'll move on to data. Clearly, a lot of data is generated, but we need to figure out what to do with it and how you use the data to feed back into the system. The other big building block is trust. And if you could switch to the website, please. This is kind of the graphic of cyber attacks taking place in real time around the globe. And you'll see that as the endpoints increase, the cyber attacks intensity increases fairly rapidly. So this is the live feed of cyber attacks happening right now. And so you can see, if you let it run for a day or two, you will see the intensity of the attacks, origination and destination. You can switch back to the slides, please. Very quick, something about the industries. So it's not just a concept, it's happening across all industries. Logistics, DHL, UPS, and others are embedding sensors to monitor the workflow. You see health and wellness applications surfacing all over the world. Actually, health is probably, emerging markets are taking advantage of that much faster than the Western markets. Similarly, heavy equipment from just a product, it has changed into a complete system of our management system that enables a lot of these players to play a different role. GE no longer sells engines, it sells services and makes 20% more. Same with travel and tourism. Smart city projects around the globe are exploding, where governments are getting involved. Transportation, some autonomous vehicles are already in play today, but we'll see them on the roads in the near future. And literally, every industry is getting transformed because of the advent of the sensors, connectivity, and intelligence. And you can even print a live functioning heart in 10 years, in less than a day, that can be used for transplant. So the question is, all this is happening, but what does it mean? How does it enhance or benefit humanity? And a number of work I've done with the UN in the emerging markets. Here we are focused on entertainment and glitzy applications, but by using smartphones and using sensor data and intelligence, it's literally transforming the lives of citizens in these places. So a lot of the work I did in Bhutan was focused on education, agriculture, finance, emergency management. Similarly, in Pacific Islands, focusing on emergency management because of tsunami threats and education and so on and so forth. And so it's not just for interesting applications, but it's literally how people lead their lives daily. So the question becomes, how do we how we ask questions to the technology and what it can do for us. The cost of traffic accidents in the US is close to $1 trillion per year. And so if we can use technology to change that equation, both the number of deaths per year as well as the cost to the taxpayers, it'll be enormous success. Similarly, tackling real world problems through the use of technology. I think that's what excites me. And beyond creating new gadgets and gizmos, I think I'm enormously optimistic about where we're headed. And just I'll end up on the note of, connected intelligence, the notion has been around for a long time. Probably the earliest incarnation of that concept I found by noted scientist Tesla, who literally thought about mobile devices almost 100 years ago. So with that, I just want to take a minute to address what does this mean to this crowd. And obviously a lot of these things are happening at a much fast pace all around the globe, but how do you internalize this these concepts and figure out what you should do? And as smaller operators, this challenge is not new. It happens to many players worldwide, and the only way you can address it is through collaboration. And without collaboration, it's just too expensive and too risky to get in. And the only way you can kind of get your arms around is by having both on the technology and business side a collaborative structure that enables you to move forward, to think about what catalog of services you can offer to your subscribers. And with that, I end my presentation.
Can you hear? Oh, very good. Thank you. Thank you so very much, Chetan. I never leave a session with him without a new perspective on where we're going and what the possibilities are. It's great to have you here. While they get set up here, just give us a second. We'll transform the stage to the next panel setup, and we'll be getting going here. As I mentioned before, you have the